The whole room watched my director click through that presentation, and I sat at the far end of the table with my hands folded in front of me, perfectly still. She didn't hesitate once. She said her approach and her methodology and the framework I've been developing 7 times in 40 minutes. I counted. I always count things. It's not a nervous habit, it's how I work. Numbers anchor me. When I count, I don't spiral. I remember the light in that boardroom the way you remember the specific quality of light in a moment you know, even as it's happening, will matter later. The windows faced west, over the Rideau Canal, and in the late afternoon of that April day the water caught the sun in long, flat strips. The client's procurement team was seated along one side of the table. Our managing partners were along the other. I was there because I had built the thing being presented, which was the only reason I was ever in rooms like that one. Someone needed to answer technical questions my director could not answer herself. She never needed to answer them that day. The presentation went smoothly. The client was engaged. One of the procurement officers asked about the provincial data integration layer, and I answered before my director could redirect the question, which is the way it always went. My director was good at many things. She was good at presence, at confidence, at making a room feel as though she understood more than she did. She had a particular skill for absorbing technical briefings. She would sit across from me in a one-on-one and ask careful questions. And I would walk her through everything, and she would nod and say, right in a way that felt collegial, felt collaborative, felt like the natural rhythm of a senior person and a junior one thinking through a problem together. I had mistaken that for partnership. That was my first real error. My name is Adrienne Gagnon, and at the time of that presentation I was 33 years old, working as a senior environmental data analyst at a mid-sized sustainability consulting firm in Ottawa, where I had been for just under 3 years. I had come to the firm from a research position at Environment and Climate Change Canada, which gave me a particular fluency in federal data systems that most people in private consulting had to work hard to acquire. I understood how federal agencies stored and reported environmental data, what format Treasury Board reviewers expected, what level of documentation the Office of the Auditor General would eventually want to see. That background was the reason the firm had hired me. It was also the reason I had been able to build what I built. The framework was called, internally, the Scope 3 Supply Chain Baseline Model, an emissions tracking system designed for crown corporations with large, complex real property portfolios. It could pull data from multiple source systems, reconcile inconsistencies automatically against a hierarchy of authoritative federal datasets, and produce layered output. The full technical dataset for specialists, a validated summary for managers, and a plain language executive brief for the people who needed to sign off on it without necessarily understanding it. That last layer was the hardest part. I rewrote it 9 times. I tested it on 2 colleagues outside the firm who agreed to read drafts. One a policy analyst, one a communications officer, neither of them technical. And I kept refining until both of them could answer questions about the results without referring back to the document. That alone took 3 months. I spent 5 months building the whole thing, mostly in the evenings after the rest of the office had gone home, and on Saturday mornings when the building was quiet enough to think. I tracked every hour. Not out of martyrdom, I wasn't keeping score in that direction, but because careful documentation is simply how I work. It's how I've always worked. I keep records the way other people keep receipts. Not because I expect to need them, but because the moment you need one and don't have it tends to be a very bad moment. In early March, I brought the completed framework to my director in her office, the one with the view of the parking structure, and I walked her through everything. The data architecture, the reconciliation logic, the provincial integration layer, the output tiers, the plain language summary, and why I'd structured it the way I had. She asked me to walk through the weighting logic twice. She had questions about the federal building inventory inputs, specific and detailed questions, and I answered them. Afterward, she sat back and said, "This is exactly what the client needs. Let me think about how we position this." I thought we were going to work on the proposal together. I thought the framework would be presented as a firm asset, the product of collaboration between a senior analyst and her director. I was wrong about both things. 6 days later, she presented it to our managing partners and the client's procurement team in a 40-minute meeting, to which I was invited as technical support, not as presenter. I sat at the far end of the table. I watched my slides appear on the screen behind her. I heard my language, Even the specific phrasing I'd used in the executive brief, a sentence I'd rewritten 4 times because I wanted it to land exactly right, come out of her mouth as though she'd composed it that morning. We won the contract. It was valued at $2.8 million over 2 years. It was the largest single engagement our firm had ever brought in from a crown corporation. My director received a promotion to managing director. Her salary increase, which I learned about indirectly through a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear, was approximately $22,000 annually. I received a firm handshake in the hallway and, "You were such a solid team member in there, Adrian," the partners noticed. "This kind of collaborative spirit is what makes us successful." I said thank you. I meant it to land neutrally, and I think it did. Then I went back to my desk, opened a new folder on my personal drive, named it Reference Archive Q1, and began transferring things into it. Every email I had sent her with draft attachments, all timestamped and sender attributed. Every Teams message where she had asked me to walk her through the methodology one more time before a client call. The full version history of every deliverable file automatically logged by our document management system, showing my username on every edit, every draft, every saved revision going back 5 months. Screenshots of comment threads where she'd asked clarifying questions that made clear, to anyone paying attention, that she had not built what she was presenting. I organized it carefully, backed it up in 2 places, and told no one. I didn't confront her. This is the part that people find hardest to understand when I tell this story. Why I didn't simply go to one of the managing partners and lay out what had happened. The reason is that I knew exactly what would happen if I did. A junior analyst accusing a newly promoted managing director of stealing her work, in an environment where that managing director had 12 years of relationship equity with senior leadership. That conversation does not end with justice. It ends with the junior analyst being labeled difficult, not a team player, someone who can't move past recognition and needs to manage her emotions better. I had watched it happen to someone else at a previous firm. I was not going to let it happen to me. So instead, I got very good at being indispensable. I kept producing work that was hard to replicate. I became the person other project teams came to when their federal data submissions were getting kicked back by client reviewers. I stayed late before presentations. I answered methodological questions from colleagues even when they weren't my projects. I built, slowly and deliberately, a reputation for the only thing that would matter when the time came. Being the person who actually knew how to do the work. 4 months after her promotion, my director was named lead on the firm's largest engagement in its history. A $3.9 million contract with the Federal Department of Public Works, tasked with developing a national emissions baseline for all federal real property from 2010 forward. The project was called Lakeshore. It had 18 months on the timeline, a team of 15, and a level of profile inside the federal sustainability community that made it the kind of thing people tracked from a distance. She did not include me on the team. I understood why. My presence on Lakeshore would have been a complication she couldn't afford. I knew the methodology in a way she didn't, and she knew I knew. She staffed the project with people who were earlier in their careers, people who were grateful for the visibility and not positioned to question the technical foundations beneath them. I stayed in my own corner of the office, kept doing my work, and waited. Offices in Ottawa are small in ways that matter. The federal consulting world especially tends to circle back on itself. The same procurement officers, the same audit committees, the same review frameworks year after year. People talk carefully and quietly, which is often more reliable than people who talk loudly. 8 months into Lakeshore, a colleague of mine who had been at the firm far longer than I had, and who I trusted because he had never once told me something that turned out to be wrong, took me for coffee near the market and told me what he was hearing. Lakeshore was behind schedule, not slightly, but significantly. The preliminary emissions reconciliation had returned irreconcilable gaps across 5 provincial datasets that hadn't been flagged in the original scoping. The Federal Client Sustainability Committee had formally identified 6 methodological discrepancies in the preliminary data submission and had requested clarification that had not yet been provided. And the project's October status report, which had described Lakeshore as on track for all deliverables, had been filed when the project was already 11 weeks behind and missing 3 reporting milestones. I thanked him. I finished my coffee. I went back to my desk. I noted the date. I kept waiting. The call came 11 months after the boardroom presentation, on a Thursday morning in March. Our managing partner, one of three, the one who oversaw federal accounts, a woman I had spoken to perhaps 8 times in my tenure, appeared at my desk and asked if I had a moment, in the tone people use when they mean immediately. When I sat down across from her in her office, and she closed the door, she didn't circle around it. "Lakeshore is failing," she said. "We have 8 weeks before the final deliverable, and the baseline model is producing results the client's committee cannot reconcile against authoritative federal datasets. Your director tells me you understand the original architecture better than anyone else in the firm." I let a pause into the room. Not a long one, long enough. She was asking me for help. What she didn't yet fully understand, or perhaps suspected but hadn't confirmed, was that the architecture she needed rescued was mine to begin with. I had been waiting 11 months for precisely this conversation. I had known it was coming because I had watched Lakeshore the way you watch weather when you already know a storm is moving. And you're simply tracking the direction. "I'm glad to help," I said, "but I want to be brought in as project lead, not as a technical resource, as lead. I want that confirmed in an engagement amendment, with my name on the final deliverable, before I open a single file." She looked at me for a moment. Not a long moment. She was 8 weeks from a federal deadline on a $3.9 million contract that was currently delivering results she couldn't give the client. She said yes. The amendment was signed that afternoon. At 4:47 p.m., I sent one email to my managing partner with one attachment. The attachment contained the original framework files, every version, every timestamp, every revision in the document management system's automatic log, every email and Teams message thread showing me building and briefing, and explaining and re-explaining the methodology that had been presented as my director's work. I wrote 2 paragraphs. No anger in them, no accusation in the register that word usually carries. Just facts, organized chronologically, with relevant file references numbered. A note that I thought she should have the full context of what she had asked me to lead. A note that I was available to discuss if she had questions. I sent it, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the window looking out at the canal for a few minutes. The way you might after you've finally set down something heavy you've been carrying for almost a year. My director came to my office before 5 o'clock. She was wearing the gray blazer she saved for client days, the structured one that said, in a specific professional vocabulary, "I am in control of this situation." Her voice carried a warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes, the particular brightness of someone working very hard to sound like they aren't. "I'm really glad you're coming on to Lakeshore," she said from my doorway. "Honestly, Adrian, it was always your framework. I've always said the technical foundation came from you. I think there's been some confusion about how I characterize the work, and I'd really like to clear that up directly." I looked up at her. "You said my methodology 7 times in the procurement presentation," I said. I counted. Something shifted in her face, a flicker of calculation, and beneath it, the beginning of a very specific kind of fear. "Consulting work is collaborative," she said. "You know that. Attribution is always complicated when you're working as a team. You asked me Teams message to walk you through the weighting logic 3 days before that presentation," I said. "You asked me 4 separate times in the 2 weeks prior to send you the methodology document. Those messages are in the attachment I sent this afternoon." She was quiet. Then her voice dropped to something lower, almost careful. "We've worked together for 3 years. There's a version of this that doesn't have to end badly for either of us." I stood up, picked up the folder I needed for the Lakeshore team briefing I had in 30 minutes, and said, "You presented my work as yours in front of the managing partners and a federal crown client. You received a promotion and a $22,000 raise on the basis of it. And then you ran a $3.9 million project into the ground, using a framework you didn't understand well enough to defend when the client started asking questions." I stepped past her into the hallway. "She has the files now. She has what she needs to understand what she's been paying for." I went to my meeting. The internal review the firm conducted in the weeks that followed was careful and arrived at conclusions that were not ambiguous. My director had misrepresented the origin of the Lakeshore methodology in presentations, in client-facing documentation, and in written responses to the federal client's requests for methodological clarification. The October status report describing the project as on track had been filed when Lakeshore was 11 weeks behind and missing 3 deliverables. Two invoices totaling $283,000 CAD had been submitted to the federal client for work the review team's examination of timesheets and deliverable logs could not substantiate. She was placed on administrative leave within 15 days of the review opening. She resigned before it concluded. Two of the analysts she'd staffed on Lakeshore, both of whom had co-signed the October status report, left the firm quietly in the weeks that followed. I didn't know the specifics of those departures, and I didn't ask. Several months later, my colleague told me over coffee that my director had approached two other federal consulting practices in the city about independent work. Both times, someone from our firm had been contacted for a professional reference. Both times, the conversation had ended before it began. I didn't orchestrate that. I hadn't needed to. The truth, once it has somewhere to land, tends to do its own work. I spent 9 weeks rebuilding Lakeshore, using the original architecture which was mine, along with 2 additional years of experience working inside federal data systems that had made me better at it than I had been when I first built it. I fixed the provincial reconciliation gaps. I sourced the building inventory data that had never been obtained from the relevant ministries. I reran the baseline from the earliest federal records and produced results that held up against every authoritative data set at every point of comparison. We delivered the final report to the client's sustainability committee 1 week ahead of the revised deadline. The baseline covered 4,200 federal properties across 12 provinces and territories, reconciled to Treasury Board reporting standards, accompanied by a plain language executive brief. The one I had originally written, updated now, better in the ways that 2 years of refinement makes things better. When I stood at the front of the Public Works boardroom to present the final deliverable, I stood in a room that felt, in a way I hadn't anticipated, like the closing of something, not just the Lakeshore project. The other thing, the thing that had begun on an April afternoon when I sat at the far end of a different table and watched my slides appear behind someone else's name. I presented the methodology in my own language, using my own name, defending decisions I had made, and could explain from first principles because they were mine, and they had always been mine. The Director General thanked me afterward and used the phrase intellectual rigor, which is a particular kind of compliment from a federal public servant, and I accepted it plainly, without too much modesty or too much flourish, because I had earned it the only way things get earned, by doing the work, over a long time, better than anyone else had done it. 3 months later, our managing partner offered me a new position, Director of Environmental Data Strategy, overseeing a federal practice area the firm was building. The salary was comparable to what my director had earned at the height of her tenure there. There was an equity component attached. And there was the fact that my name would be on the methodologies that went out the door, in the room when they were presented, visible in the acknowledgments of every report the practice produced. I accepted, and meant it fully, the way you mean things when you've built them from the ground up and you know exactly what they cost. My colleague sent me a message the morning the appointment was announced internally. It said simply, "Well earned. Anyone paying attention already knew." I've kept it in a folder. I've never labeled anything in particular, sitting alongside Reference Archive, Q1, which I haven't opened in a long time. I don't need to anymore. What I learned in those 11 months of silence is not something that fits easily into a performance review or a professional development session. But I've carried it carefully ever since. Document your work. Not because you're suspicious, not because you're planning for anything, but because the moment you need to prove something and have no record of it is a very specific kind of helplessness I don't recommend. In environments where intellectual contribution is the actual product, where what you're selling is your ability to think and build and make something that didn't exist before, your name on your work is not a vanity. It is the entire point. Keep the version histories. Keep the timestamped drafts. Keep the email chains where you explained your methodology to someone who later claimed not to need the explanation. And if someone takes it from you, if you sit in a room and hear your own language spoken by someone else's mouth and attributed to someone else's name, do not confront them in the moment. Not because you're afraid, and not because you're weak, but because the moment is not the right container for what needs to happen. What needs to happen takes time. It takes a folder and a reputation built quietly on excellent work, and the patience to wait for the situation to arrive at a shape where the truth has somewhere to go. The loudest voice in a room is not always the one that wins it. Sometimes the one who wins is the one who counted to 7, went back to her desk, and built a record so complete and so careful that when the right moment finally came, all she had to do was send one email and let it speak.